I've heard you say that we could mix Neanderthal DNA in human DNA to make stronger bones for people who would otherwise get osteoporosis. That was sort of the intro soundbite that I got for the book, and I was like, I'm sold, because I want to know how to make myself more caveman to make myself more resilient. On the other hand, it sounds incredibly dangerous and probably like it's a terrible idea.
Yeah. So first of all, that's not entirely my idea. So George Church, who's a preeminent geneticist, scientist at Harvard, really like pushes his thinking to the very edge of plausibility in a way that I think is incredibly profound and beneficial. And one of those edge cases is, we've got human DNA, but like, is this the best we can do? There are derivatives. At some point we forked. Is there something about those who were living near us, around us? Is there some other part of our evolution that we might be able to tap into? And if so, would that make us more resilient? The bottom line is we are facing existential crises on this planet, right? And it has to do with climate change and food security and all kinds of things. And in fact, this morning, NOAA announced in New York City, which was kind of a weird place to make an announcement about hurricanes, that this is going to be the worst hurricane season on record. They're expecting 4 significant storms. There's this weird phenomenon where there's this like very hot pool of water that's going to hang out around the Gulf and just add more energy to the atmosphere. The planet is changing. Our bodies aren't evolving as quickly. So what if, one way for us to prepare for the future was to make our skin a little thicker, for there to be more collagen.
Like literally thicker skin, not
Literally.
A metaphor for something.
No,
okay.
no. Although, Jordan, I like where you're going with that. I also think we should have thicker skins, generally speaking.
Twitter doesn't even bother me anymore, thanks to this Neanderthal DNA that I've injected.
Oh my God. Can you imagine what a better world we'd live in if Twitter didn't matter so much to everybody?
Yeah.
Anyways, but yeah, both metaphorically and literally, if we had thicker skin, could we withstand the elements a little bit better? Now, people will say that's a terrible idea because it's tinkering with what God made. It's just tinkering with life, and also doesn't solve the climate issue. And what I would say is, hey, doesn't this give us optionality? And let's just explore and see where we get. It doesn't necessarily mean monsters. So Neanderthals had much more collagen. They had thicker bone. They had better bone density. They had some things going for them that we don't.
Yeah, this is so interesting because it dovetails nicely with other episodes I've done on technology augmenting the brain. And it's like, hey, let's skip the wires and just figure out how to change our actual body into, I don't know what you would call this, like meat hardware, right? Like I don't need night vision goggles. I can literally live with night vision that I can use at any time. And it's in there.
Yeah, and again, I would put to rest immediately ideas that this tech is ready tomorrow, right? We're talking about long horizon technology. But yeah, this is what, so you're right. We keep coming up with hardware solutions to things that might someday be wetware solutions.
Wetware, yeah.
Right? And again, if you allow your mind to wander productively, think about some of the conversations we're having about space and becoming a multi-planet species, and specifically Mars. At the moment, we are not, in our current form, in our current containers, humans aren't really designed to survive on Mars. It would take a lot. It would take a lot of infrastructure and building, right? And even if we did that, you've still got radiation, you've got all of these other issues to contend with. Well, what if we augmented ourselves so that we could live on Mars? There's another way to start thinking these things through. And again, not tomorrow technology, further in the future tech, but you have to start thinking about these things today, and not being constrained by reality as it exists at this moment.
Yeah, I've heard we need to be sort of, like you said, radiation proof, maybe use less water and food because it's going to be hard to come by when you're flying to and living on Mars. There was a lot of concern, or not concerns, a lot of different ideas about what we would need to be concerned about if we ended up living on a planet like Mars. It kind of sounds horrible, but there's people that are up for that as long as they don't die on the way / the second they land, right?
Yeah, I think there's something called the paradox of the present. So I'm a quantitative futurist, and my job, when I'm not writing books, is to use data and build models to identify plausible next order impacts. And so most of the time I'm doing this for large companies who are trying to figure out where's their next big bet, what's the next big strategy, or what's the huge risk that's coming, and how do they mitigate it. But the same principles apply to thinking about yourself and your own personal development, and just, thinking in a more profound way about your own life and how life itself evolves. And as it relates to Mars, I think we get stuck in this thing called the paradox of the present. And that happens all the time, actually. Business, individuals. The paradox of the present is taking what you know to be true today and assuming that the future is that but more, or that but faster.
Yeah.
Right? And what we tend not to do is explore uncertainty with an open mind and agree that there's any number of variables that are potentially in play. So we could become a multi-planet species by augmenting our genetics so that we can withstand greater radiation. That's not plausible at the moment, but it's absolutely plausible, sometime in the relative near future. So just because we're not doing it today doesn't mean that we can't do it tomorrow. So when you hear scientists very validly talk about why life on Mars is implausible and whatever, it's because they're using today's constraints. It's the paradox of the present.
That does make sense. I mean, it's hard to take. I mean, this is your job, so it's easier for you. But it's hard for someone like me to go, oh yeah, all we need to do is just put a bunch of solar panels up there. Oh, there's not enough sun that gets to Mars. Oh, well, that idea is never going to work. And it's like, well, wait a minute. If solar panels are getting better, then you can create more energy with less light. And so you'll have these solar panels that are 1,000 times more sensitive than what you'd ever use on Earth. And then your concern that you have now is moot and not even really worth thinking about, right? That kind of idea?
Yeah. And again, it's sometimes people get frustrated when they have conversations with me because my answer to a lot of things is maybe.
Well, yeah,
or,
like
right?
Lawyers do that too. Don't worry, you're not alone.
Yeah, so I dropped out of law school before. I made a last minute decision. You're a lawyer. I made a last minute decision not to go. I think I would have been a disaster in law school.
Well, yeah, like me as well.
Anyways, right. So like solar panels make sense to some degree on this planet. There are lots of different options for energy. We have to come up with the right solution when we start thinking about off-planet living. Again, we always are hamstrung by constraints, our own mental constraints. And we also want answers. Most people are not comfortable with uncertainty. Certainty drives much of the daily decision-making that we all make. And that is fine, but it creates a lot of problems.
Can we define synthetic biology? The topic of your recent book, and most of what I talk about, or what I have to talk with you about today, is going to be synthetic biology. But most people don't know what that is. And people who've been listening for a long time have heard my episode with Rob Reed about printable diseases that I'll touch on later. But otherwise, it doesn't really mean anything to the uninitiated.
Yeah, totally. And actually, if you're a regular listener of this show, believe it or not, you've already been hearing about it. You just haven't had the vocabulary to describe it. So synthetic biology is a relatively new interdisciplinary field of science. It combines design, computer science, biology, engineering, and the goal is to redesign or design organisms on a molecular level to have new purposes. And that makes those organisms more adaptable to different surroundings or programmable so that they do things that you want them to do. And this field is really intent on seeing how we can make life in an organic way programmable. So if you think about computers, you have different levels of permission. You've got read access to files. You've got edit access and write access. Well, the same is true in biology. We had read access. That was when Watson and Crick use somebody else's work without giving her credit. That would be Rosalind Franklin. And they could see, the double helix. And eventually that laid the foundation to sort of read what was there. CRISPR is edit access. So that's being able to go in with sort of molecular scissors and making SNPs. Synthetic biology is write access. And by that I mean there are scientists writing new genetic code and booting cells up from scratch.
Wow.
And those cells that are alive, technically have computers as parents, not other organisms.
That's a really awesome explanation and makes it 1,000 times more interesting than I've ever heard this explained before. Because the idea that we can create new organisms that are not just, because right now we breed things, right? If you want a turtle that's albino or something, you've got to find, 2 albino turtles and breed them. I don't know how it works, but you've got to do something like that. This is like, actually, I want turtles that glow in the dark so that they can be used for some weird, creepy purpose.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're totally right. Glowing things, by the way, is the sort of hello world of a synthetic biology. So when people get started, a lot of their early projects are like, make things glow. There's glow fish. Somebody made like glow in the dark beer. So glow in the dark albino turtles, like Jordan, that's an awesome project you could work on.
Yeah, it doesn't seem very useful, and they would get eaten right away by whatever eats turtles, but it's fine. Maybe you want to bio-illuminate a restaurant so you make all the things in the fish tank glow, which also sounds mean, but whatever. The idea is I have no idea what kind of example to make other than that because the possibilities are so endless that my mind is truly blown by this. And we could create all kinds of... the idea that I've had for a long time that I have, of course, no idea how to implement is some kind of organism that eats plastic, right? Because we have all this plastic in the ocean. We have all this crap in the dump. What if something like a worm eats it and then it just grows big and dies and then becomes fertilizer? And it's like the plastic that we bury or that we throw in the ocean is just gone now. That would be amazing.
So actually you're on to something important, and enzyme eating plastic is definitely something that it's research that's underway.
Plastic eating enzyme, right?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, other way around.
Yeah.
Plastic eating enzyme. Is there an organism that would eat plastic and excrete something that wasn't dangerous, for example? So that's one set of experiments. Another one is, well, maybe could we just use less plastic to begin with? So plastic is made out of petroleum. And the problem with that, as we all know, is it's not great for the environment. We also have supply chain issues, as evidenced by what's happening in Ukraine right now. And part of, where the global supply of petroleum comes from. There's a really cool company that is making skis out of algae. So skis, if anybody's ever I ski very badly, but you don't want your skis to be like super floppy.
Yeah.
That is, right?
Yeah, I know that much.
So if you had skis or snowboards that had the rigidity that you need, but only, let's say, 30% of the plastic, and the rest was made out of algae that is totally biodegradable. You haven't totally solved the plastic problem, but you're using a lot less plastic. And also, when you make skis and snowboards, they use forms, but then they have to cut around it, so you wind up with a ton of waste. So this reduces some of that waste. There's also nylon. It's like a lot of the cool stuff happening in this space is not designer babies. It's redesigning stuff that is pretty toxic. So like nylon is in just about everything that we use to some degree. And again, this is a product that requires petroleum. Well, now researchers have figured out how to make the same molecule, but out of like fermented sugars instead.
Oh, wow.
And so you can have biosynthetic nylon, which is just as strong and durable, but again, not as problematic when it comes to supply chains and geopolitics and obviously climate change.
I read in your book about the leather that's made from spider silk. It's obviously not really leather, but it's just like some sort of an analogous compound that's maybe really hard to tell what it is. And it's like, hey, this didn't require torturing an animal and all the other things that go with raising an animal in the first place, just for the skin.
Yeah, so it's there's there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the space, and there's a company that is making silk out of different compounds. There's also a company making leather out of mycelium. So this is like the the complex underground sort of fibrous root structure connecting mushrooms to each other.
Yeah.
There's a pair of Adidas that are coming out sometime soon. They may have already come out, that are made out of this stuff. They're leather, like to the average person, you would think they were leather shoes, but they're actually made out of mushrooms.
That's so incredible. Mushrooms are themselves just incredible. They talk to each other somehow. I mean, it's just really like alien level technology somehow. That's a whole different show. The idea that synthetic biology could upgrade humans and other species is interesting. I don't want to delve too far into the sci-fi, but a lot of what I read in your book was not even sci-fi. Like, it was really totally on the roadmap, maybe a long time in the future, but still totally on the roadmap. But things like nuts and crops that need less water and have higher yields to feed more people, or can maybe grow indoors with less sunlight or at different elevations or whatever. This stuff is not super far away, correct?
No. And you know, of all the things we wrote about in this book, there's a lot of, I think, controversial concepts and ideas. The future of agriculture was not the part of the book that I thought was going to set off a firestorm of public debate and, you know, have a lot of like calls to cancel me online. And yet that's kind of what happens. So,
are you kidding? That's like the most.
I am not.
I picked that as like a softball to ease into the other stuff. Yeah.
No, the multi-parent future, not so much. But like messing with agriculture. So, a couple of things. There are already gigantic warehouse scale indoor plant farms, indoor plant factories operating in Europe.
They're called greenhouses, if memories like, right? I mean, they're
not really. I mean, it's
okay.
The difference between a traditional greenhouse, which is a little smaller, and what we're talking about, which is inside of a huge warehouse, to some degree is light. So there's fiber optic light, not direct sunlight. The conditions are different. And there are plant factories that are operating underground effectively.
Wow.
That are growing enough produce to supply many local grocery stores throughout Europe. Now, why would you go through the process of growing things indoors if it requires modifying the DNA of the organism, which immediately makes people think GMO? There's a lot of reasons. First of all, genetically modified is not tantamount to some kind of like Franken tomato, right? Franken monster, horrible piece of produce. It just means that in a responsible way, somebody has tweaked the organism so that it is more resilient in different conditions. Okay. It doesn't necessarily have to do with fertilizer or something like that, using some brand's fertilizer. If you can very slightly tweak the genetic code of organisms to grow indoors, that gives you control. You don't have to worry about extreme weather events or hurricanes. You use significantly less water. It is much less taxing. It's actually, in some cases, better for the planet than other ways of raising produce. And you've got less variability. So it's actually a good thing, but it's very controversial because it is not the way that things have traditionally been done. But the other way to frame this is agriculture, as we know it today, really hasn't changed in like 14,000 years. It hasn't. We've got big tractors, but we're basically doing the same stuff. There hasn't been huge innovation. So there's that. There's also, this unlocks new ways to get meat proteins.
Yeah.
If you have 4 grams of beef muscle tissue, you can produce, 28 billion pounds of beef, which is more than enough to feed the United States and how much we consume.
Wait, why is that? 4 grams? Wait, how does that work out? I guess I missed that.
Right. So the way that there's no company doing it at scale yet, because at the moment it's still cheaper to produce beef by raising livestock. But you get what's called a bioreactor. So imagine like a gigantic pressure cooker. And you start with tissue cells, which you can extract from an animal without harming the animal at all. And then you feed it amino acids, you control the temperature and everything else, and you wind up with edible tissue.
Wow.
I mean, Yeah, I can give you a crazy example of a place where it's already been on sale, if that's
Yeah,
useful.
please do. By the way, 4 grams, that's like an earlobe worth of
Right.
tissue. Like, so
Right.
if you want a giant earlobe, you could take one of mine and grow it, and you can eat for a week off of the results.
Well, I mean, here's maybe a way to think about this. I love that, by the way, that the earlobe. That's a wonderful analogy.
Yeah,
but
feel free to use that one. It's pretty gross.
It's pretty gross and pretty awesome. But sourdough bread, right? COVID's the pandemic's
Goes great with
favorite
earlobes,
bread.
by the way. Yeah.
Right. So like to make sourdough bread, you have to have a sourdough starter. And one sourdough starter over time, right, becomes this huge yield if you keep it working. So it's another way to sort of wrap your head around how some of this works. I don't know if you know this, but in February every year, the entire country shuts down for a single event, an event where the men take the ball and they move the ball down the field for the points. Are you familiar with this event?
Okay, yeah. I don't watch it, but I have heard of it.
I don't watch it either. This is the Super Bowl. And I think those who are not playing football in the Super Bowl are constitutionally mandated to eat chicken wings. My point being, Americans on a single day on the Super Bowl consume 1.5 billion with a B chicken wings.
That's so
and that requires
ridiculous.
725 chickens that we consume on a single day. So think about what that requires. A massive cold chain.
725
million chickens.
Million chickens, right, okay.
To get to 1.5
I could have done
billion
that math
chicken
in my
wings.
head, I think, but I didn't try. Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
It's,
Wow.
if you think about what it takes to get that to happen, you need a global supply chain with a cold chain. So this is what makes it possible to transport things that have to be preserved. You need to grow chickens fast. Today's chickens that you buy they're like monster chickens. They're like pumped full of hormones and antibiotics, very different from chickens 100 years ago. And so this process is not great for us. It's definitely not good for the planet. It's really not good for the chickens. Isn't there another way to think about this? So again, this is where synthetic biology comes into play. If you start with the tissue, the muscle tissue, you ferment it over time, you can have delicious, wonderful chicken meat that never had any of the hormones, wasn't engineered to grow super fast. And you could create that at scale. We could have 3 billion chicken wings for dinner. Now you're not going to get the bone yet. So it's going to be like a chicken wing sort of type of thing.
I mean, you can put it on a stick. I think people will survive. That's a barely an adjustment, right?
So, I mean, the economics don't work out right now. That you're not going to go to 10-cent chicken wing night. I don't know if those exist anymore. They did when I was in college.
They're probably 25 cents now, but yeah.
They're probably more. So it's going to take a while. But this chicken has already gone on sale in Singapore. It took 2 years to get through a regulatory process. But you can buy it and you can eat it there now. And if you stop and think about the profound implications here, what's really cool is we could actually have significantly more meat than we have today, but we could also have significantly different meat. You could eat panda steak and feel totally fine about it because no pandas were harmed in the process.
Right, like a lion. You could have lion just to see what it's like. Yeah, I can see
you could
the...
have Cocker Spaniel kebabs, right?
Yeah.
And nobody
still
wants to
sounds
think about
gross.
eating.
Yeah.
It still sounds gross. I would absolutely eat Cocker Spaniel kebabs and feel totally fine about it.
When I thought about this, when I read about this, I was like, that sounds gross when I say it out loud, but I was going to ask about lab-grown tissue for consumption, just like you brought up organically here. And then I thought, okay, I have to clarify that I don't mean growing human brain tissue so I can eat brain sashimi or something. I was thinking more like lab-grown fish could prevent overfishing and destructive trawling and things like that. Lab-grown meat would eliminate the factory farms that we talk about, the pollution going there. But also, and I think you mentioned this in the book, you could grow, if we want to call it growing, you could grow sushi in Nebraska instead of shipping it in from the coast with an airplane or a cold truck. And you could be eating fresh sushi that's grown in the restaurant where you eat it in Turkmenistan or Sudan or something like that.
That's absolutely right. I grew up in the Midwest on the south side of Chicago. Are you from the Chicagoland
Michigan
area?
Michigan. Yeah. Sort of.
Can I show you the hand? Are you
Yeah. The hand.
Southern?
I am from, I got to do this in a mirror,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I'm from right here.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Detroitish?
Yeah. North of
Yeah.
Detroit.
Yeah. Okay. Anyways, so like Detroit. So I don't know if you grew up eating lake perch at all, and now that I think about it, that lake perch was probably not super healthy given the industrial area that they came
I'm sure that I grew up eating a lot of stuff that was caught in the Great Lakes that had lead in it from, Ford, GM, and all the automakers, they just dumped everything into the Rouge River, which flows God knows where into those lakes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, every now and then I have a taste for lake perch, which is what I grew up eating, and it's actually kind of hard to find where I am now. So yeah, like I could have a little fermenter, or I could open up a restaurant with a little fermenter, and I could ferment and grow lake perch, healthy lake perch without all the heavy metals in it, from Lake Michigan. And, again, like it's just a different way of thinking. And what we're talking about right now is so contradictory to what exists today that it's just really hard for people to conceptualize what that could look like. And then it becomes scary, because what we're talking about invites a lot of disruption in the economy. I think it also invites a lot of opportunity to grow in a better way, but it means change, and change can be scary.
What about, if we can grow, let's say, rib meat or chicken wing meat, how far away are we from being able to grow an actual functional organ, right? Like, what if I get poisoned by Vladimir Putin asking for a friend and I need new kidneys and a liver?
Yeah.
How far away are we from being able to grow something that's not just like muscle tissue that's edible?
So that is one key area of this research. And again, as with everything, is there a way we can grow something or engineer something to fix a problem? And then is there a way to just engineer a fix to the problem, right? So let me address the second one first, which is organ growing. So I'm sure listeners to the show heard about the artificial heart that was grown inside of a pig.
Yeah.
That was transplanted.
They gave it to a guy and he passed away a few weeks later, right?
Unfortunately, he did. The growth and the surgery itself were huge milestones, very successful. Turns out that there's a virus that gets carried, and I think what happened was he kind of got infected with that virus. Pigs and humans are much more closely related than we like to think. So tweaking the genomes is one tiny little baby step. But ideally, we don't want to have to sort of grow millions of pigs for their organs. Ideally, we'd just like to grow the organs. So that is definitely on the roadmap. And right now, there are lots of projects growing what are called organoids. So these are teeny tiny little blobs of tissue that you can connect on almost like what looks like a clear domino. So picture like a clear piece of plastic about the size of a domino, where you've got like a respiratory system with real cells, real tissue.
Wait, is this like a small in scale respiratory system?
Yeah. Or you could have a tiny little endocrine system or a reproductive system, and it's called a body on a chip. And you might say, why in the hell is anybody doing this?
Yeah, like what's the use? But I mean, it's also just really freaking cool. It's like a micro machine, except it works, if people remember those toys from the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, totally. Well, there's a real good reason why. We have this new virus, SARS-CoV-2, and we need to test different therapeutics and try to understand it. We don't really want to do that on a real person, but we also need to do it fast on some type of simulated real person. Otherwise, we don't get to answers. So bodies on a chip are ways to test, run experiments, test therapeutics, test different products to see how the organs respond. And it's just really, you can actually Google this and you can find like circulatory systems on what looks like a translucent domino that are functioning human organoids that you can learn from and watch.
That is beyond fascinating. So we can really just grow these tissues or these systems, these whole systems in a lab, and then I guess, infect them and say like, hey, and then we try a tiny dose of a drug in that same thing. We say like, okay, that didn't work. Next. And you can just do that tens of thousands or millions of times until you find something that really, and you can do all sorts of things that would be completely unethical. Like, we're just going to microwave it. Can't do that with a patient. Right.
Right.
Wow.
Right. And again, like, so these are teeny tiny little organs, but this is kind of the magic of what we're talking about. It just gives us optionality. It also gives us the ability to program tiny little organs, tiny little blobs of tissue. So there are some researchers that got some cells from an African clawed toad, I think is what it's called. And they used those, edited them, and created an organism that they can control. And it's a tiny, by moving it around, I don't remember the exact technical.
Like a remote control?
Yeah.
Frog?
So these are, it's called a xenobot. So these are, I'm sure you've heard of lots of people talking about programmable like nanobots.
Yeah, sure. Like I'm waiting for them to be able to brush my teeth because I freaking hate doing that every single day of my life. Yeah.
I'm brushing my teeth. Part of the reason why I'm a little playing with my teeth a little bit, I just had to get Invisalign.
Oh, I had that.
So oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I never had orthodontia, so I'm just brushing my teeth constantly now.
Yeah, and they hurt kind of because they're slightly moved out of place. Oh, it's so irritating. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm whatever. I'm a big baby.
I sympathize. Yeah, like first world problems. Oh, this really almost painless, convenient solution I ordered in the mail to make my teeth perfect kind of hurts. Oops.
Yeah. Anyways, but yeah, there's programmable blobs of tissue. There's an AI system somebody just developed to play tic-tac-toe, but it's actually living organisms that played tic-tac-toe, and they were programmed to like win the game. It's a new type of neural net, but made out of, biology, or
like
at least
actual neurons. Yeah, that's what? How is that? So how do they keep it alive? They just spray it with water every few minutes? How does that even work?
That part I don't know. But what I do know is that we have to come around to the idea that hardware and wetware are kind of becoming the same thing, right? That really and truly biology and computers and technology, they're starting to intersect, to meld.
Yeah, this is like the most cyberpunk thing I've ever heard. I thought that was so far away, and here we are.
Yeah, I mean, but again, I think people always expect walking, talking robots. The future is here. The famous line that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. What I would say is the future is here. It just didn't show up the way that we all expected. And therefore, we miss it. We miss the developments in real time because they don't meet the expectations that we had. They don't have the shape or the form factor that we were expecting. So we miss things until they reach a level of maturity. And then it's like, well, shit, how do we miss all of this? And we get really upset and we freak out and we feel like things are moving fast. And then we want to rein things in,
Yeah, that's sort of... Every time I have any sort of medical procedure or hear about a new one, I'm always like, this is incredible that this exists. So I had LASIK in the 90s. You know what that is? Where they like laser your eyes. So I had LASIK in the 90s.
That's early days. Yeah.
And I was really scared to do it. But it was like the guy had a great reputation. I don't know. Who knows? I should probably Google it. But anyway, I'm 42. I have better than 20/20 vision. I've never needed glasses except before LASIK. No contacts, nothing. And it's like that was just, I couldn't believe it existed at the time. And you're telling me that in, I don't know, whatever timeline we're on, at some point, I might just get new eyes that are not infected with like glaucoma or whatever disease that I might end up with when I'm older.
So I love that analogy for a couple of reasons. One, there's actually a lot of work being done on sight. The eye, so my husband's an eye doctor, sort of as an aside.
Oh, wow.
And the eyes are tricky. They're also a lot of people don't realize this, but this is the direct connection to the brain. It's the only part of our body that is sort of on the outside, directly connected in. And there's not blood. I mean, you can sort of more easily do stuff to manipulate the eye. So that's why some early days SynBio work is actually being done to edit things, to make it easier for people to see, things like that. The other reason I like what you mentioned is because you've already augmented your body. LASIK is just common now, and so we don't think about it as a body mod, but it totally is, right? Somebody lasered your face.
Yeah, and I let them do it. They lasered
Right.
my eyeball, not just this isn't
Right.
like getting a tattoo like in Starship Troopers where they're doing the laser tattoo. This was I let somebody laser
Right.
my eyeball. That's
Right.
frankly ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. Has it improved your quality of life?
Oh yeah, unbelievable.
Right. So it's common now. Like LASIK is not a weird thing. And I guess the reason I love what you mentioned was because I really think 10 years from now, we're going to be talking about synthetic biology the way that we talk about artificial intelligence today, which is to say everybody's got an opinion. Very few people know what they're actually talking about, but it's part of the public dialogue. And then 20 years from now, we're going to have a lot of these applications that seem today to be sci-fi, right? But will be normal 20 years from now. In fact, people 20 years from now will look back at us as barbarians for having eaten meat from like raised animals for their meat, for food.
Totally agree. Like I'm imagining my grandkids or even my own kids being like, wait, I read in a textbook that they were only able to synthesize lab-grown beef in 2030 for wide consumption. So did you just never eat meat before that? And I'm like, oh, are you going to tell them or am I going to have to do this? And it's like you're just going to have to break it to them that you would take your pig outside and kill it yourself and chop it up and eat it. And they're just going to look at me like I'm a horrible, evil person. It's just going to be completely backwards. It's going to be like when you read now about somebody who they bled themselves out to get rid of the Black Plague or something, and you're just like, oh my God, you backwards bastards. What were you thinking?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I absolutely think people are going to, as we all do, right? This is not an original thought. We always look back. Every generation has done it and marveled at how people got by when things were so challenging and tough, or like, why would they do these barbaric things? That will happen to us too. But I also think there's an opportunity for people to look back to this moment in time and say, man, that was an interesting time, an exciting time to be alive, because they were the beginning of all of this. They were the originators. They were the ones who gave us all of these options, who put humanity on a better course. So I think there's maybe two ways to look at that.
Yeah, at least we were giving it a shot and people were aware of the problem, which in many ways makes it worse that we're still doing it, but also at least like, hey, we tried. Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. Synbio, synthetic biology, is now in many ways quite nascent, new, up and coming, long horizon, I think is what you'd said. So it'll soon be ubiquitous, or in many ways it already is, but the stuff we're talking about will at some point be ubiquitous, and people alive in a few decades won't understand how we lived without it. Okay, but where are we on this curve? Are we on like America, AOL, dial-up internet, or are we still at internet only at universities, or are we even back where the internet was like two guys in a lab and they're like, when I type on this computer, I can make it go over to that computer. You're not going to believe this. Like, where are we on that sort of curve?
Right. So we are not at the metaverse part of the hype cycle yet. So we are I don't know how nerdy everybody is, but I would say we're kind of at the TCP/IP stage, which is my way of saying we've got proof of concept. We've got lots of early, really solid research. We've got products that work. Messenger RNA is a product of what we're talking about. It is synbio. What we don't have yet is scale. So the analogy that I use in the book is the very first phone call that got made in Chickering Hall in New York. On a fateful day, Alexander Graham Bell stands on stage to demonstrate this contraption, this like wooden thing with a metal thing sticking out. Nobody's ever seen anything like this, and he's promised. This is back in the day when like demo days were all the rage. So versus what we have now, which is tech companies showing things that aren't all that interesting anymore. Anyway, so all these people gather. He's like, they're ready to go with the demo. And there's a voice on the other side magically coming through the speaker. And he explains this new device, this telephone, as a way of communicating with people who are not in the same place. They scream bullshit. They're like, this is all made up. They're mad. They demand to see behind the curtain. And this angry mob comes behind the curtain to see that there is no person there, and that, in fact, this contraption actually works. Completely blows people's minds. But it would take another 20 years, 30 years to build all the infrastructure, right? Because you needed power lines, you needed transistors, all these things. And then it would take a few more years for the first paper to sort of posit an intergalactic communications network that builds on all this technology. It would take more years to get to a satellite. And anyhow, now we are 2022. We're having an internet conversation with audio and video. We're nowhere near each other, right? And it's the communications industry is so big. All these economists have tried to calculate the total value of this ecosystem. There's no way to do it. The only way to really calculate the value is to do it in reverse, to see what we would lose. We are at the Chickering Hall phase right now of synthetic biology, which is to say the technology exists, it works, but it hasn't scaled yet. Now, is it going to take 20 or 30 years to scale? I don't think so. I think we're on a much shorter time horizon. I think it's going to wind up ballooning into this enormous, massive, huge economic juggernaut, the way that some of our other core technologies have.
That's sort of my next question, right? Semiconductors, there's Moore's law, right? And I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's like over X number of years, these things halve in size and cost, right? Do you know that off the top of your head by any chance?
Yeah. So this is Gordon Moore, who was at Intel at the time. And so Moore's law, again, posits that with time, and it's basically been keeping current, that the number of transistors, and you can cram more things into a smaller space and get more power out of it, and the fees come down. So that has, for the most part, continued to hold. There's a version of that in synthetic biology.
Great.
That a guy named Rob Carlson came up with, and those are called Carlson's curves. But it's the same basic concept. Over time, you're going to have much more compute, much more power, and be able to build more things at scale with reduced costs. We're already seeing that happen. Originally, when they sequenced the human genome, it took many years and billions of dollars. You could get a sequence, several years ago for like $1,000. Today, there's now whole genome sequencing. You can go online and basically get your whole genome sequenced for less than the price of a pair of Nike Air Jordans. So it's just time and experience and maturation tends to lead to, scale and reduce prices.
When we talked on the phone a while ago, I think one of the questions I asked you was about DNA sequencing, and we went off on a little bit of a fun tangent about how it's not a great idea to maybe give your DNA to the companies that are doing this. Do you still believe that, or did I get that right?
Yeah, you totally got it right. So the number one holder in the world of genetic data, do you know who it is? Or who would you guess?
I don't know, 23andMe or Ancestry.com or something like that.
So you're close. It's China. China holds the most.
That's much scarier in many ways.
Yes. Hashtag agree. So China's the number one, followed by, you're absolutely right, 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Ancestry.com got bought out by BlackRock, I want to say, for a lot of money. BlackRock was not interested in subscribers, like people who were really interested in like looking for their ancestors. What they were buying was all of the stored
Blackstone
DNA
bought it.
Data.
Sorry.
Blackstone, thank you, not BlackRock.
I always do that too. Don't worry about it.
Yep. But again, this is a really interesting thing to poke at and really think through. Pre-COVID, I don't think most people were like, yeah, totally, take my DNA and I'll get some. It's like, I don't know, it reminds me a little bit of being in college, and there was always like a credit card vendor giving out a T-shirt ahead of the big football game,
right,
to get people to sign up for. You get a T-shirt to take more debt. We'll give you this colorful shirt that you can wear. It's
like
a little
three
bit,
sizes too big. Yeah.
yeah. So these prices are coming down so much in the sequencing space. The data are worth so much that at some point it's likely that these companies will just, give you your data profile for free in exchange for housing your DNA so that they can learn from it. So part of that is like, it's not nefarious necessarily. It's more like you're being monetized and not getting a share back.
Okay.
So like companies are like doing all kinds of research to find new therapeutics, learn new insights. And again, I think that's a good thing. I think that should happen. But what's the social contract? Like, could 23andMe take all of this data and sell it to a third party? Or what's the cybersecurity protocols? What happens if these companies get breached? That opens you up to, that's not like somebody stealing your email,
Right.
Right. So like, what if there was a breach? What if you got biologically doxxed? Doxing is when somebody gets a hold of your personal information and publishes it on the web for people to harass you and do whatever else with. Well, what if they publish your genome? There are people like George Church and others who say, take it, it's fine, do what you will. But there is a security risk here. And you don't have to create a deadly virus to make somebody's life absolutely miserable, There's also a lot of information that you can tell from somebody's profile. And there's also a lot of possibility for misinformation. There are people who would purport to say, I can tell you based on your DNA what your cognitive range is, meaning like how smart you are. Now, that's a hotly contested topic because what makes somebody smart and how they express those smarts is like related to many different things. But let's say that you're actually a really smart, you're an expressive, creative, smart person, but according to some schmo, like your markers put a probability like in the lower 50 percentile. That kind of stuff matters in the public, and it creates this swirl of totally unnecessary misinformation. So I'm totally, speaking of tangent, yeah. But
No, but it's scary when you think about that plus authoritarian regime, right? So,
Totally.
and we don't have to necessarily even talk about China. We could talk about a fictional country, or we can just say, let's say North Korea gets it, and it's widespread. So everybody who is not going to be that smart, not going to be that great of a producer, they can just say, you know what, we don't need these people at all. They're going to be a drain on our limited resources, and they can do that at birth. And it's like, sorry, you can't have this baby. It's not going to be a good citizen. And then, that is very dystopian and horrible.
It is. It's actually a story that we've read before, if anybody's familiar with Huxley, but it's true. These are not totally fictional stories here. And some would say that there's evidence that some of this work to understand cognition and potentially enhance cognitive abilities is being done now in China, which I think we should all find ethically concerning, but also is like maybe that's a security issue for a lot of countries.
Yeah, let's talk about that because I have heard that China is making genetically engineered babies. What level of truth is there to that, or is it because in many ways it almost sounds like is that more nonsense?
Right. So I can just speak from my own perspective and the research that I've done. I don't think we will ever know. I lived in Hong Kong, so just after the handover. So, it wasn't technically China at that point, or sorry, just before the handover. 99. Yeah, and I went into China a lot. I also lived in Japan. My take on this is China is very, very cloaked. They're very opaque. So what's actually happening will be challenging to sort out. What we do know is that there are super pigs. They have been developing pigs, in part because of the African swine flu that wiped out, I think, 3/4 of China's pig population, and they're very reliant on pork. So they've created new pigs, super pigs, that can grow faster. They have more muscle, meaning you fewer resources, you get a bigger animal that you can consume. And they've been engineered to withstand fluctuations in temperature, so they're more resilient. They've created double or quadruple muscled police dogs. So there's all kinds of experimentation that's already underway with livestock and animals. And of course, we know about the scientist who reportedly edited using CRISPR embryos that resulted in a live pregnancy and the birth of twins. Now, depending on who you talk to, this is a pretty polarizing issue. I know people who will argue adamantly that there was full transparency and all of the parents who were involved in the study knew what they were signing up for and that this was altruistic. And they will quote sources from the Chinese Communist Party who took them on the tour and showed them, revealed everything to them.
Yeah, that's up there with those people that tour Xinjiang for a YouTube video, and they're like, there's no genocide. Look at the people dancing in the street, which is totally normal. Yeah.
Right. I'm, I guess, more skeptical or more jaded or much more of a pragmatist. I don't know. I spent a lot of time there. I lived in the region for many years, and I just think that's implausible. So what actually got published? The study shows that the twins were edited to be HIV resistant. Now, in China, that is actually a thing. Stigma, the stigma against people infected with HIV is horrific, really bad. It's 2022. This is a manageable condition, and it's a big deal for people who have it. But it's not like we ostracize people with HIV. But that is not the case in China. So one way to look at this is he was a compassionate scientist who was trying to prevent offspring from having to manage through the stigma of potentially being infected with HIV, which seems like a big stretch. The other way to look at this is some of that same research was conducted on mice, same parts of the genome, same areas. And that research was being conducted to see if their cognition could be enhanced. So my question is, was this about reducing susceptibility to HIV/AIDS? Was it about that plus cognition enhancement? Or was this about seeing if they could jack up the IQs of people by 2 points, 5 points, 10 points? And again, IQ measurement is another mystical, crazy science. However, there are studies that show, a few 5, 7 IQ points is the difference between a kid who takes, Algebra 2 and a kid who's taking AP Calculus, right? It does matter. And the truth is, we'll never know what actually happened. We will never know. They will never be. This is not like the IAEA. It's not like nuclear arms development where you can see from space who's doing what. This is very opaque. It will never know. What we do know is that there is a high probability that on this planet right now, there are now enhanced humans, and there are analogs like you and me.
That is both amazing and incredible and scary in many ways. And not because oh no, we don't measure up, but also it just could create such a huge divide over time. It would be truly, let's throw the national security implications out for a second, but it would be truly unfair in so many ways if we were just doing this, let's say, even inside the United States. It'd be like I think in the book you call it a genetic trust fund, only it's much harder to overcome, right? Because we've seen trust fund kids screw things up, and we'll see enhanced humans screw things up too by throwing away their potential. But it really is something you almost can't squander. It would be very difficult to do if done correctly, and it would compound seriously over generations. But it really does seem unavoidable. Back to national security, who doesn't want their country's offspring to have this kind of advantage?
Right, and it seems like a weird concern. There's so much to be concerned about, but I think that's a form of bioescalation.
Cyber biological arms race, right?
Yeah, which we really don't want. Because what's going to happen if it turns out that China is actively experimenting to enhance? What are we going to do? Say that puts the rest of the world in a really tricky position. I could think of a couple of ways that might play out in the U.S. Maybe there's like a WPA that like
WPA?
during FDR. So like during FDR, there was this sort of public works program to sort of get people to volunteer and serve their country, and I could imagine something like that. But serving your country means submitting to enhancement or agreeing to have your children enhanced to keep pace. If you lived like there was a lot of sort of galvanizing activity around the end of World War II and the Cold War. I could also see this causing like an all-out civil war in the United States, because we're really unlike other places in the world. We can't have conversations with each other about life, where it comes from, what to do with it, how it ends. We really have made that a polarizing issue. And again, it comes down to certainty. Everybody's so certain of what they believe that they don't make space to listen to what other people believe. And listening doesn't mean you have to agree. It does mean that you're willing to be open-minded. And if you have a change of heart, that's okay. We're not really set up for that in this country. And so if we wind up in a situation where there is a country or a cluster of people or some group of uber billionaires who go seastead out in the ocean where laws don't apply to them, and they're creating a super race of people, I think that's actually going to divide the United States, not bring us together. So, yeah, I don't know. I know I'm describing like an apocalyptic hellscape of doom.
I mean, possibly. It also just seems like not only could this be the plot of a Jason Bourne film, but also it just seems really very possible that there's also exists in the United States, and it's just very secret, and the people who have these enhancements don't even know. Or some, I mean, I could be ridiculous. I don't know.
To truly do the types of enhancements that we're talking about, this stuff is years off, many years off. What is likelier to happen in the nearer term is again, just optionality in the U.S. So one of the things in the book has to do with procreation. There is a way to create a stem cell, or there's a way to use a stem cell and sort of make that become any other type of cell it wants to when it grows up. What that means is you could turn a skin cell into a sperm or an egg. And the implications there are that a single person could create an embryo with just their own genetic material. It wouldn't be a clone.
I don't know why that's so sad, but somehow that just seems like really sad.
Yeah, I mean, it does. But I also have I've got some friends who wanted to start a family and just didn't have a partner. And they have to go out and find donor material, which is like really hard to do.
Yeah, I can see that.
It also opens up the possibility that you could have you could have multiple parents. You could have a 3-parent child or a 10-parent child. If you watched The Expanse or read the books, I don't think I'm spoiling anything because it's revealed right away. There's a character that has a whole bunch of parents. That it's just different. It's different than how we think of family today. I don't think that's bad. I think it gives us some options. And again, I think that is
weren't
more
humans
likely.
back in the day parented by the whole tribe anyway? Isn't that kind of a thing? So it's like now you just have genetic material instead of them not knowing who the father is. It's not that different.
Yeah, but again, like it's just constructs. We're just going to have to be comfortable with. We're going to have to get comfortably uncomfortable, and I think that's going to be hard. I think it's going to be hard. And if it comes out, and I don't know how it would, but if it comes out that they are doing enhancement, which we know is happening with animals, if it turns out it's people, my concern is that we're not going to be able to come to the table and have a reasonable conversation because politics and arguing is going to get in the way.
Yeah, it's going to end up, which means the military is going to be the only place that this can have, some place that can compartmentalize this in a very secret way, which is like a kind of another. not great for science when it's like, okay, we have to keep this really secret and not tell people who might not like it and not talk about it publicly. That's just never a good recipe. That's just like CIA extra, what is it called? Extraordinary rendition centers. Like that's what you end up with, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And again, like if we step away from the, like, what does life look like in the future, there are the much more real potential problems of things like cyber bio malware. So the way that SynBio works is you still need computers. You're developing code. Instead of ones and zeros, it's ACTG. You have to write the code, you have to edit the code, you send the code to a printer, you send it to a manufacturer. And it's been proven more than once that there are vulnerabilities in that system, and you could create totally benign biological code, get back a blob of like a blob of something that's not very interesting, right? But you could inject malware in the process, meaning you could send off a benign sample and get back a potent virus, a deadly virus. Now, luckily that hasn't happened yet, but there are, this is not, it's not like human scientists are standing with a pipette, in individual test tubes. All this stuff relies on AI, the cloud, 5G, on tech. And tech is insecure. I mean, the number of old school phishing email attacks is up like 51% Q1. So, there are vulnerabilities that I think are much more pressing that we have to really think through and prioritize.
Yeah, this stuff will keep you up at night. Our episode with Rob Reed, we have a trailer at the end of the show. He talks about having DNA printers in high school labs or college labs, and what happens if somebody who knows what they're doing designs super, super contagious and also super, super deadly influenza or some other pandemic, and then says, and goes kind of the terrorist route and just releases it, or even accidentally gets infected with it and spreads it all over the place. That stuff will keep you up at night. It's just the dual use dilemma, right? When good tech ends up being used for bad things like chemical or biological weapons, and sometimes it happens by accident.
Right. Now, to be fair, there's a lot of tech in our daily lives that could be dangerous if it's misused. This ruler that I'm holding up, if I stabbed you in the neck with this enough times, it could kill you, and this plastic ruler could therefore be a deadly weapon. So I think we have to approach this with some amount of just sort of common sense. Anything can be misused. I think the trick with this biology stuff is that biology tends to be self-sustaining, and there's usually not an off switch. So part of the concern here is that there is research that's been done to try to make things more virulent. So I think it was 2002, some researchers from Stony Brook, University of New York, state of New York at Stony Brook, I think. It was SUNY. This was a project funded through DARPA. And basically what they were trying to figure out was, could they recreate smallpox?
Oh, gosh.
Was it smallpox or polio? Hang on a second. I
That's
think it was smallpox.
Either one is really scary. Smallpox especially.
Just like using off-the-shelf materials. And the answer was, yeah, they were totally able to do that. The point of this was to sort of help the greater research community wake up and be like, hey, maybe we need some controls. But there was a different project done later, about a decade later, and that researcher, who was in Europe, was working with H5N1, which is the avian bird flu. Before SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID, this was the deadliest virus to hit humanity since the Spanish flu in 1918. And it used to it was passed between birds. And the experiment that he was doing was, in his words, not mine, to mutate the hell out of this to make it airborne and passable between humans. And it's like, why would you?
Why?
For what purpose? Okay, so this is something called gain of function research, GOF, gain of function. And when I've heard people talk about it, their reason for wanting to do the research is that if they can figure out the worst possible ways that a virus will mutate, that will allow us to be prepared. And my feeling is we're still living with a deadly virus mutating constantly. And we were able to sequence SARS-CoV-2 in basically a handful of hours.
Yeah, like maybe wait until we have the problem instead of being like, look, I found the most deadly thing ever. It's already ready for when it gets out. And it's like, dude, it didn't exist before you did that.
Exactly.
Why
and
make
just
it?
because, right. And like, how many possible simulations are you going to be able to build? There's too many potential factors in play. So I don't think there's any reason to do this research at all. And my concern is that, again, the vast majority of people in this space that are working in synbio they're not doing any of this, right? They are doing things like, hey, could we make a tomato that doesn't rot, after you pick it for a week?
Right.
Or can we make a leather jacket looking thing out of mushrooms? Can we make beer that doesn't give you a hangover? It's that kind of stuff. There are other researchers who are engineering viruses for a different reason, to deliver medication, right? A virus is just a container for code. So viruses could be created to target cancer, for example, right? But there is the specter of what if, because we've already seen it before, somebody creates a dangerous use for these things. What then? Or what if, and we have to be aware and be thinking about it.
I do like the tomato example. That's gain of freshness research, I guess. Huh? So, dad jokes, can't help it.
No, it's perfect. Perfect. I love that.
You can use that one too. So you mentioned that biology is self-sustaining. Okay, that makes sense, right? It's a living thing that you create. We discussed earlier specialized microbes that could eat plastic and water, and I think in the book you mentioned something that could turn wastewater into drinking water, which would be great. What happens if those things escape, right? I guess you have to think about how to make it so they're not always self-sustaining, or they're only active when there's another ingredient nearby, so you're dumping that in the area where you want it to eat the plastic. I don't know. I guess those are solutions, because the last thing you want is, these things are everywhere now, and so now anything that's plastic that's touching water, like hoses and pipes and residential infrastructure, is now also getting eaten by these organisms that we made to get rid of a trash patch in the ocean.
Yeah, so this is the sort of law of unintended consequences side of things. Just after the Dust Bowl, there was an enterprising guy who was like, we need to rewild these large swaths of the country that have lost vegetation, and happened upon this plant that seemed to be pretty drought resistant and hardy and would help make things green again. This plant is called kudzu. And initially, it got planted and it was like helping things out. And fast forward to today, you drive anywhere up and down the 95 corridor on the East Coast, it looks like there's some monster in the summer. It's just vines everywhere choking out the rest of the vegetation. So, that's a good framing to think through how edits with the best possible intentions could have undesirable consequences. I know that there is research being done into sort of like a biological off switch, and if things did start to grow too much, maybe there would be a way to sort of get them to stop growing that wouldn't involve a weed killer or something like that. But again, this is very early days, and I think what I think is heartening is that I know people are thinking about that. And trying to work through it.
Yeah, the geoengineering stuff kind of freaks me out just because it's so hard to predict, right? Ecosystems look like they're all perfectly balanced because for millions of years ago they weren't, and then something got extinct or died. Like people go, well, look how in harmony everything is when humans don't mess with it. It's like, well, yeah, but we had different types, and we know this now, of different types of, are they called hominids? Like humans lived in concert with other earlier humans. They just all died. We outcompeted them. They're dead now and extinct. Yeah. And so we don't want to do that to plants that we use or animals that we need or other things that keep other things in balance, because we can easily mess this up. Like, hey, there's no more plastic in the ocean and nowhere else for that matter either. And frankly, you probably shouldn't ingest that because it's going to get to your plastic heart valve and that's going to go now. And it's just like that could go horribly wrong if we aren't careful with it. And it's impossible seemingly to think of all the potential outcomes of something like that. So the best thing to be able to do would be to unplug it if you can. Yeah.
I mean, again, this is where I wish we could think exponentially and act incrementally all the time. These are sort of opposing forces, but it's what you need to both have a vision of the future and work toward that North Star of what you're trying to build, what's better for society, for the planet, for everybody, but be willing to sort of make incremental decisions on the path getting there, which might mean at sometimes changing course very slightly. When it comes to geoengineering, again, this is a place where China has already moved ahead of a big CCP meeting. They cloud seeded. They made it rain for the purpose of getting the smog out of Beijing. It's going to be challenging to get everybody to the table to make some agreements about some possibilities. On the other hand, do we have a choice? COP26 ended without, that was the big environmental global meeting, without people walking away feeling like they accomplished what they needed to. And that's because India and China are enormous economies whose economies for the moment rely a lot on coal. Mm-hmm. And we live in a globalized situation. Globalization forces many countries to rely on India and China. And you can't say to them, hey, let's stop producing all that CO2 without giving them a solution or changing our price structures or lots of things.
Like, we want you to still make all our stuff, but you just can't do it using the way that you produce energy now. You have to come up with a new solution. See you guys later. Yeah.
Right. So I'm not trying to be a fatalist here, but the reality is that we're not moving fast enough to deal with the problems we have. So rather than trying to get everybody to agree to cutting like CO2 emissions, there's a constellation of cool science and tech out there. Can't we try a whole bunch of things while still trying to cut emissions? So that's some of the geoengineering stuff. And, small scale experiments. Could we engineer a leaf? Could we think of the CO2 that we have as a feedstock that we just have too much of, right? And have like a bargain basement fire sale on all the CO2 and like engineer leaves that can suck more of that CO2 out of the air and excrete beneficial compounds that would help the topsoil. Those experiments are underway, but it makes people feel uneasy.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I like the idea of like a grass that grows all over and just hoovers up carbon and shoves it into the ground.
Yeah.
And we did a whole episode on geoengineering, episode 348, and I got a ton of emails about stuff from experts that were like, experts in all these different fields where this guy was positing ideas, and he's like, this is such a bad idea. Here's all the things that could go wrong. So I was up for like 3 days just not sleeping because I was like, please tell me they're not going to try to do this. Because whenever you come up with what sounds like an awesome solution, like that grass solution, somebody who's horticulturalist is going to go, okay, sounds good, but here's all the problems with that. And then you go, okay, well, that, like you said, it's so hard to get it right.
Right. Then what you do is the next step. So I think the place that we're, as a society, getting stuck is somebody's got an idea. Somebody else says, but, right? And then and then there's arguments. What would be better is, I've got this idea. A whole bunch of people say, oh, have you thought about it this way? You could have the but people. Or maybe this is the other way to think about it. And that leads to a series of conversations and incremental improvements. We've kind of forgotten about the let's argue with each other productively for the purpose of getting those incremental improvements in the idea. If we were talking about anything else, if we were doing product design, that's what would happen. A normal product design cycle begins with idea. You have a design charrette, you've got people arguing back and forth, and you go through an iterative process until you get a product that people want, AKA your iPhone, right?
Right.
But with this other geoengineering, editing humans, Cocker Spaniel kebabs, we don't go through that iterative process. Instead, what we wind up with is an explosion, an incendiary process, not iterative, where instead of the conversation being productive as it moves along, it becomes like this entrenched supernova that at some point, explodes into horrible. There's another way to do it. There's another way to have the conversation. I invite people to disagree with me vehemently, as long as they're willing to do that in service of productive thinking. Disagree, let's argue, and now let's move on to the next part of this conversation and see where we get.
It's an incredible future that's just coming at us seemingly really fast. And I know you said this is long horizon technology. I get that. But what is the timeline for most of what we discussed today? Are we talking about 30 years from now, or is this going to sneak up on us and be here in like a decade?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. But let me tell you why. We have sort of a model with 3 horizons, H1, 2, and 3, which describe relative near term, midterm, and longer term.
Okay.
Over the next 15 to 20 years. I can tell you, generally speaking, what our model shows, and then explain to you why that could all be wrong. Generally speaking, things like new uses for messenger RNA, new types of vaccines, lots of new diagnostics, whole genome sequencing, nearer term. Things like self-healing paint, stronger materials, nylon, alternative to leather materials. That would be Horizon 2. The third one is meat at, synthetic meat at scale, cultured meat at scale, or biofuel has like long been the holy grail, which I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but it's longer horizon stuff. Now, let me tell you why I don't know. The answer is because this is a space where there's a lot of still sort of basic research being done, and there is no way to schedule an R&D breakthrough, right? You can't do that on a quarterly schedule. So there's that. A lot of this work sort of is adjacent to what's happening in artificial intelligence. So as computational systems, pattern recognition, DeepMind, which is doing all kinds of crazy things under the Google umbrella, as all that advances, that brings SynBio along with it. So that's another piece. Investment is another huge piece. So, I don't know if we're going to wind up in a recession or if it's stagflation. I don't know what's happening on the horizon exactly. But I do know that in the investment sector, there's a lot of very concerned venture capital types who are confused and feeling less certain about their investments. And some limited partners are calling back their investments. That creates a level of uncertainty. And at the same time, there are some companies. There's a company called Altos Lab, which has huge names attached. What they're trying to do is to figure out how to reverse aging using some of this technology, reprogramming life, right? They've raised $3 billion.
Wow.
I don't even know what a valuation on they don't have a product out. They've just got a collection of very smart people. So there's so much volatility, and there's so much impact that for me to give you an accurate prediction at this point of when the inflections are, like that is not a model that I would be able to build. So it's fine. We don't have to know exactly when. We just have to be ready to observe those inflections as they're happening. But generally speaking, because I know this is what people want to know, sometime in the next 10 years.
I mean, that's so fast.
Years.
That's so fast. That's really incredible. Because I think people, when they hear about this stuff, the reason I asked is they're like, oh yeah, 50 years from now when I'm dead, we might have the ability to No, you're going to see this crap in the supermarket in 10 or 15 years potentially, right?
And maybe the other way to think about it is you won't be dead in 15 years.
Hopefully
or 50
not.
years.
Right, yeah. Oh yeah, 50 years, yeah.
50 years, because
would
part
be
of,
tragic.
Yeah, no, that would be horrible. A lot of the excitement around this technology is, there's some research into looking at cells as like biological DVRs. If you can sort of record and watch what's happening in a cell, can you figure out at what point you can reverse the aging process? There's all this work being done to reprogram cells so that they age slower or not at all, or some of the sort of zombie material that floats around that's not quite dead and causes some problems that doesn't happen anymore. I think we're going to have, again, some optionality on how long our lives are, and that's coming too. And it'd be interesting to think about living very long lives where you are relatively healthy and with it, and you have a very long, happy life and like one really bad day at the end, right? Versus what we have now, which is power and youth, and then suffering for a lot of people. Yeah,
that stuff, the cognitive decline and all that stuff it really freaks me out. It's just really so awful to see up close with your own family and then think like, oh my God, I'm going to end up like that possibly. That's horrible. Do you have time to tell me about personalized bioweapons? Because that crap is, speaking of things that keep you up at night, is so interesting.
Yeah. So if you had somebody's whole genome, you could figure out ways to tinker with it. Not that it kills the person, but just makes them super uncomfortable, or it's, inhibits them in some way, or just makes, gives them chronic diarrhea, stuff like that.
Okay.
So at WEF, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, this was 2 years ago, there was an artist collective that shortly after created a website and auctioned off items like used coffee cups and forks and things from the people who were there to anybody who wanted them. Now, I don't, they could have been making all of this up, but having been there myself, it's very hard to get into the sort of inner circle of what's happening. And staff are very well screened, but there's always a possibility that you've got some leak somewhere. And yeah, you leave stuff all over the place. I'm constantly drinking coffee, and I drink my coffee, I put my coffee cup down and somebody takes it. I don't know who's taken it. So it is possible to scrape somebody's DNA from detritus. If you were able to do that and you could sequence the person, then what might you be able to do? Well, again, you could create a virus that gives, somebody could have created a virus that gave a president just chronic stomach cramps, diarrhea, some type of, problem. It doesn't kill them, but it makes it hard for them to lead, hard for them to make decisions. And again, this may not seem so catastrophic, except that if this happens to a CEO or a board of directors member, there's a fiduciary responsibility. It could have an economic consequence. It unlocks a fresh new hell where biological ransomware exists.
You're going to have diarrhea for the rest of your life unless you pay me some of that Dogecoin, Elon.
Yeah, exactly. Or I will make your hair fall out, celebrity.
Again.
Pick your celebrity. Yeah. Unless
the first time was bad, Elon. Try the second time. This time you can't put it back in.
Yeah. I mean, again, is it totally improbable? No. Is it around the corner? Probably not. But did Emmanuel Macron tell Putin, I'm not doing a COVID sample for you, bro, because it's you? Why would I want you to have my DNA?
That's interesting.
Yeah. So again, I think, and if it had been pre-COVID, I think we would be much more comfortable saying, yeah, I'm never giving my DNA to somebody. It's obviously. But we live in COVID times. And a couple of weeks ago, I had to have a PCR. I just proved that I was PCR negative. And I was I had to go to a guy in a van in Dumbo, in Brooklyn. Just weird. Literally a guy in a white van. I show up and he's like, okay, let me take your sample. And I'm like, who are you? I have a latex allergy. Are those latex gloves? He doesn't even know what I'm talking about. The security protocols, is what I'm trying to say here, are quite squishy.
Leave something to be desired. Yeah,
exactly. But we've arrived at this point in our time, in time when we're I'll go to I need to get into this event. Hey, schmo, guy in the van by the river. Shove that thing up my nose and take my DNA.
God, that is incredibly disturbing. I mean, he, in all likelihood, just threw it away after getting the test results, but there's no way to know. There's just no way to know.
No, but the point is, the bigger point that I'm making here is that we're all becoming desensitized to being skeptical. I mean, and we should take tests. I'm not saying don't take tests. I'm not saying don't, practice good, safe health habits. What I am saying is it's okay to take the test and also say, hey, by the way, where is this going? Who's got the data? How are they being stored? The tech is not going to know that, those answers, but we should be asking them. It's okay to ask questions like that.
I mean, they might know if they throw it in an incinerator right after they take the... results
Yeah.
for you. I mean, that's possible. And they should know something like somebody there should know something like that. The guy in the van, maybe not. He probably just drops it off somewhere, but everybody else. Yeah. Well, either way, your point is well taken. Amy Webb, thank you so much. Really, really interesting stuff. I wish we had 2 more hours, but this was incredible. There's so much in the book like this. And of course, I'll link to that in the show notes as well.
Thank you so much. It was a fun conversation. Fun and scary, but fun.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. We dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, subscribe.